Hey, what's up, everyone? Quinn here. It is July 2nd, 2019, and I thought I would make my next video, or rather audio recording, over the current polarization of our nation's government. A few days ago, I was thinking back to my freshman year of college, about a year and a half ago, in one of my general education classes, which was political science. And during this one particular class, we were talking about polarization and gridlock within Congress. And I remember thinking about how all the my fellow students were trying to come up with solutions for how the government could get out of a situation like this, and they were calling the entire situation of gridlock a failure. But then I was thinking, and I basically asked my professor, if the government's in gridlock, doesn't that mean they've pretty much have solved all easy stuff, or rather obvious things? And my professor was pretty surprised when I asked this question, because most of the time when the government's in gridlock, people call for bipartisan solutions and stuff like that. Now, you might be wondering, well, is that it? Is just that story and your one theory about it? And no, that's not it. I have quite a few more minutes to go on this video. And the major point that I want all my listeners to understand by the end of the video about my theory is that all of these issues that the government's resulted in becoming gridlock over the years were very much cultural issues, such as gun rights, drug rights, abortion rights. Like, for example, back in World War II, it was a completely bipartisan decision to declare war on Japan after Pearl Harbor. And lately, the past few decades, we haven't really had that much bipartisan conclusions on various cultural topics. But moving forward, especially with the 2020 election, I think nowadays we're beginning to focus more on economic issues rather than cultural issues. As I personally believe, I think we've pretty much have solved most cultural issues within the United States. And currently, I believe most cultural issues are very arbitrary. For example, certain gun bills limiting magazine capacity, and other bills such as the transgender bathroom laws on the East Coast. And when I think of all these cultural problems that have been solved throughout the years in the United States, they all come down to our Supreme Court's decisions regarding interpretation of the Constitution. But sadly, though, we don't have a Constitution which determines the economic system of the United States. Moving forward into the 21st century, our political system will begin to move away from solving cultural issues, and they will begin to become the regulators of our supposedly free markets. And you could see this in the news previously last week with the Democratic presidential debate for the primaries. A lot of the candidates have begun talking more about economic issues such as free college on Bernie Sanders' part and universal basic income on Andrew Yang's part. Now, with both of these two issues being much more extreme on the long term than our previous cultural issues, such as the southern border wall, gun rights, and stuff like that, these issues have long lasting impacts on how this country will function, perhaps to the end of its days. Now, what what should people be aware of? And that is basically that our government is moving into a position to have much greater control over our finances, like I mentioned before. There are certain issues with regards to that. Personally, with Andrew Yang's universal basic income, I believe that eventually, if the government continues to give out free money, it will lead to hyperinflation. Because how do you stop a policy like that? How does a candidate run in the future and basically say enough is enough? We've given out $1,000 for long enough, and remove a policy like that? It's absolutely ridiculous. I think we're at massive risk of hyperinflation through quantitative easing going into the future. Then again, how do people protect their assets? It's through tangible assets. And I think probably one of the last intangible assets will be in other currencies. Up until recently, I've been pretty critical of Bitcoin within my research, but I think specifically with this situation in the United States with candidates sort of decreasing our wealth just by handing out what we think is wealth. And with that, I think Bitcoin has much greater potential now for this situation. I wasn't able to see these issues arising previously, but now I am. Besides Bitcoin, I think real estate. I've never been a fan of precious metals and stuff like that, but I think real estate, Bitcoin, and specifically with real estate like farms and stuff like that, I think you have to be able to store your wealth securely as well as be able to continue to grow it. Because I think one of the largest issues, according to Andrew Yang, is automation. But the thing about automation is, well, we're going to need a completely different society anyways. So all these US dollars he wants to give people out in the future, they'll be absolutely meaningless. And I think that's part of his plan for the long term. I mean, he's in his 40s now. I don't know if he'd ever be able to see that day because I'm pretty skeptical of how long automation will take, anyways. But with that, he'll never see the consequences of his actions, which I think is personally one of the big issues of much older politicians of today. But going back to my point, though, with our current policies of our government, if you even if you have your wealth invested, like for example in the stock market, it's still quantified in US dollars. And I think people have to be pretty um, they should be pretty cautious of that. Not for another decade or so, but I think moving on into the future it's going to be a massive problem because like what this whole video is for, it's to say that we've solved most of the cultural issues in the United States, and it's all dependent on politicians completely manipulating our finances for their votes. So I think the most responsible thing I think anyone can do personally is to keep on the lookout, especially with the next election coming up. I wouldn't even call these policies socialist. I think they're more or less, I think they have good intentions, but within politics, people's good intentions only have to last them for the rest of their political career. These current policies in place by our government for finances, I I think politicians need to start talking about how this will impact the future demographics of this country and people's ability to store wealth. I mean, if people store wealth in US dollars, then I think we as citizens should demand that our US dollars don't go to waste. Now, the next point I'm going to be bringing up is pretty Marxist in a sense, but I think with universal basic income, you're completely detaching the currency from work. And I think at that point, I think we've completely have moved beyond socialism in any sense, and we've pretty much have moved into the new era of wealth storing. And this is completely became a game of hot potato where whoever the last person is holding US dollars in like 2050 is just going to be completely broke. It's going to be an absolute mess. So I think at the end of the day, I think people need to start moving their wealth into real estate, not necessarily for another decade or so, but I think people need to stop being weary of it. And it ever, if any situation like this ever moved quickly, I think it would definitely be sensible to move wealth into Bitcoin because, of course, with the debasement of the currency, other countries are obviously not going to allow you to buy bonds or their stocks on um, their exchanges with U.S. dollars. So I think this is going to become a massive money laundering and tax evasion scheme over the next 10 years. But that concludes my video. I think this will be more or less part one to my series on moving into the future past culture changes and moving into the economic changes that this nation requires.